you for coming back promptly from lunch. I think most people were here this morning, so there's no need for us to go through our detailed introduction again, but just to say, I'm Keith Holland. My colleague is on my left is Jeff Salter. We're conducting this examination on the basis of an informal discussion which we lead on the basis of questions that we ask in the light of your representations and what you've said and the response we've had from the states. The whole purpose of the hearing is not for you to repeat your representations, but for us to probe and sort out any queries we've got. When you are talking, there aren't many people in the audience. We've managed to frighten most of them away or bore most of them away this morning, as usual. That's very usual. But if there are some people, if you are speaking into your microphone, please speak quite loudly and clearly into the microphone, because some people were struggling to hear this morning.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the microphones are just for the live stream. So apparently people couldn't hear me very well because I was just speaking normally. So you need to project your voice so that other people in the room can hear you.
Right, thank you. We're dealing with housing demand and supply issues this afternoon. And I want to start with, I don't know if it's Mr. Parker, if you're going to be discussing it, or whether it's going to be Mr. Nicholson. I'll start with you, Mr. Parker. Okay. You've told us that you think the housing target should be at least 6,484 homes, rather than the state's figure of 4,000 homes, and that's really what I want to explore first. It seems to us that the big ticket items in the difference between you, there are three of them, I think. Firstly, the shortfall figure, which they put at a much lower figure than yours. The makeup, how many years do you want to take to make up that shortfall? You say the shortfall should be made up in 5 years. They've built 10 years into their figures. And then the third big ticket item, I think, are the migration assumptions. And they are using a cautious approach, talking about 700, a population increase of 700 from migration and 100 natural increase, about 800. You say, taking a more optimistic view about the economic situation and the uncertainty about COVID and Brexit, you say at least 1,000 rather than their 700. So those seem to me to be the big items that make a big difference to the figures. Now, I don't think there's any point in us discussing the assumption. Your view is clear. Your optimistic view is clear. Their cautious view is perfectly clear. And before you mention it, I must say I have read the Fiscal Outlook paper, which you've probably seen as well, which talks about things being more confidence, but nevertheless still uncertainty. So I'm going to talk. Sorry?
Was that the April paper?
No, it's November.
No. I've not seen that one.
You've not seen that one. Well, it's worth reading.
It's not really any blame. It only came out on Wednesday, together with a housing paper as well, which you should have seen.
I have seen that.
Right. So I want to start by asking about making up the shortfall, the 5 years, 10 years point. I think the States doesn't believe that there's a capacity on the island to make up the shortfall in 5 years. I mean, their view is that really it's unrealistic to talk about making it up in 5 years and building that into your demand figure. And they point out that, in fact, on average, they've only had about 400 a year built on the island. Your figure's slightly lower, 373, I think. So you want the rate of construction of homes on the island more than tripled. Do you think that's realistic?
Thank you, sir. You've gone through my report fairly comprehensively there.
We have.
I think we're entering into the policy on, policy off debate. I was taken on to look at the numbers in terms of the totality of it, and in fairness, the bridging plan proposal is very definitely a policy on proposal, but breaking down the elements that you've identified from my report, the shortfall, to be fair, I don't actually know how that number is calculated or generated. Obviously, it's gone up from 1,800 to 2,050, which is fine. The 5 or 10 year period, that shortfall, we're having sort of a statistical debate. It's houses not built, it's families not housed. So
Yeah.
when we say let's spread that over 10 years, we're asking those families that haven't managed to buy or move into affordable housing to wait over a longer period. Now, the consequence of that to date has been the problems that I think everybody's familiar with in terms of the prices of market housing and the unavailability of affordable housing. So I do think it's reasonable that if you've set yourselves a target and you've missed that target, that irrespective of projecting and forecasting forwards, that you do your darndest to catch up with what you said you were going to do, but you haven't done. So I do think it would be reasonable to take the 2050, whatever the figure is determined to be, over the shorter period rather than stretching it out again over the 10-year period, if that answers that specific aspect.
We're in the old Sedgefield, Liverpool discussion.
Yes, so well, I spend most of my life looking at
I'm sure you do.
schmars, etc., and
I'm sure
very
you
similar
do.
debates.
Yeah.
As to the migration assumptions,
Well, pick that up.
my reaction is simply to look at what was set as the original thought and then what appears to have actually occurred since sort of 2007-8. There's various figures set out, so we can see this average seems to have gone between 1,000 and 1,200. That's not my conclusion particularly. That's a sort of a direct lift from the OAHN of 2019. So to base the affordable forecast pretty much directly upon that calculation, but then do the calculation for the overall number on a plus 800 calculation, you're mixing up two sets of figures. Now, I'm not seeking to question the totality of the affordable demand, but if you take a calculation from one methodology and apply it to the total from another methodology, then the totality of affordable as a proportion percentage of the total clearly is going to be wrong, just mathematically. And so that's why you've gone from trying to achieve 19% affordable housing back in, forgive me if I get that wrong, the 2004 plan, which became 26%, which became 25%, and which is now being promoted on 36%. Now, that's a mathematical problem, but also as a consequence of not hitting the numbers in the first place is why we now need more affordable housing. So you conflate two issues and create another one, and then apply that as a solution to the problem that you created in the first place, which to my mind is...
Yeah, no, I understand the mathematical complication.
So the migration assumptions are not mine, sir. I'm not putting forward figures for you to consider. I'm just saying, well, here's the numbers that have actually occurred. It would seem reasonable to...
And the states would, of course, say, well, our conservative migration figures are taking into account the uncertainty that we face at the present time. But I think there's no point in discussing that. I think I understand your point of view, and I understand that.
Well, I think there's two responses. So one, I'm basing mine on the sort of the historical trend line.
I understand.
And also, I think if you ask anybody in this room that's anything to do with development, planning, construction, we're back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good.
Indeed.
Our problem, you see, is that when you say, well, if you've got a backlog, ethically you must recover that as soon as you possibly can.
Yes, sir.
Our problem is one of the things we have to do is test whether the plan is deliverable. And if you produce a figure which really isn't a deliverable, that's an issue for us.
Yes, sir.
So that's why I asked you the question about whether you think you can triple the number of houses that are built on the island each year.
I think there is a partial way forward, sir. I can't offer it as a guaranteed solution. There were 330 sites, I believe, came forward when the call for sites went out, and I gather 16, excuse me if I'm getting the numbers slightly wrong, are going forward to be zoned for affordable housing. No problem with that. If you go to table H1 and the underlying assumptions that you find in the, I keep calling it the call for sites, the land availability and site assessment.
Yeah.
When we look at the certainty that is being attached to the various sources of the sites, Windfall comes forward as a medium.
Yeah, we'll be moving on to Windfall.
But if you zone a site, it comes forward as a low certainty. Now, to my mind, that's completely back to front. If you want to be sure of building more market housing, my experience from the UK is that you get a better guarantee of that if you go through that site assessment and allocate zone sites for it. So.
We'll be moving on to that. We'll be moving on to that point. I'm just looking at the shortfall. There's now the figure from the states, of course, is now 2,050 because of fewer completions in the past. Your figure is a different figure, nearly 3,000. Your demand figure is just below 6,600, and the state's figure is 6,100. That's quite a big difference. Not just explained mathematically.
It's not my figure, sir. The 6,760 is the direct lift from the OAHN forecast for the 1,000+ migration scenario.
Okay. Do the states want to respond to that? Is that right? If that's right, that's correct. That's your figure. So why wasn't your figure built into the plan?
Just to confirm, sorry, I think what Mr. Parker said was that the 6,000, so I can't remember the...
6,760.
Is a lift from the OAHN report.
1,000+ scenario.
Which is a 1,000+ scenario over a 10-year period.
Yeah. Is that based on the 2018, wasn't it? OAHN report?
2019.
19, I believe.
2019, thank you.
But obviously that applies to a longer plan period than the housing supply in the Bridge and Island plan.
And then the supply figure, you said 3,617 from monitoring data and an assumption for the last year, the last 5.
Yeah, I took an average of 5, I think, yeah.
Okay, I can understand that. But the states say their figure is 4,058. Again, quite a big difference. And I don't know if there's a difference because one is gross and one is net, or why there is this difference. Can somebody explain that?
I can't, sir, no.
You can't.
No.
The states explain that.
Yeah, perhaps I can. The figure, obviously... Sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Ralph Buchholz, Government of Jersey. The figure in 4,058 is up to when we wrote and drafted the plan this year, so it includes a period of supply in 2021, basically. So I don't know if the figure that you were referring to before was up to the end of 2020, perhaps. I don't know what the...
No, they're the same period. They're the same period. I'm struggling to understand the difference.
So which?
Well, you say from monitoring data, you say up to the, you say 3,617, and you added for the last year when you didn't have completion data, you used an average for the previous 5 years.
Was that not up to 2019?
No, to 2020, you've
So
said.
there's another figure of 4,180 between 2011 and 2020.
Your calculations, though, seem to me to have been based on this 3,617 figure, and that's the 4-year genuine data and 1 year where you made an assumption.
I could find a breakdown of the numbers other than seeing totals.
So can we be fairly certain that the completions, the state's figure is an accurate one? And it's a net figure?
Yes, it's a net figure, so yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't know where any of the figures come from, so that's part of the problem.
Well, I mean, I must say, reading the documentation from the states, it seemed to me that I could actually work out where the figures came from, so I'm surprised you say you can't.
Where the totals come from, so it's how the totals are
I
calculated.
see, yeah. Okay, all right. Well, that's, as far as I'm concerned, the big questions about this difference in supply and demand and supply. I want to move on to the situation with the windfall situation, which you raised yourself. When we appreciate the point you're making, that if you want open market housing, you need to allocate sites, basically. And moreover, you need to allocate sites probably outside of the built-up areas, because you're looking for 3+ bedroomed homes. That's essentially a point you're making. Mrs. Day, from your point of view, from the state's point of view, I don't know if it's you or somebody else from the states, but we're finding it quite hard to assess how reasonable your assumptions are about open market windfalls. Because Mr. Parker tells us that you can't really rely on windfalls, and we're finding it quite difficult to understand where your windfall figure comes from. Now, there are about, you tell us, 700 open market homes under construction at the moment, and you've got another 700 with planning permission. So my question to you is, did virtually all of those 1,400 come from windfalls?
Yes, that's the short answer, basically. In the open market area, that's all windfall development.
Okay. So, Mr. Parker, windfalls in the past seem to have been a hugely successful way of identifying land for open market housing.
The brief that I've had, sir, is the low-hanging fruit, as was described to me, is rapidly being ate, so that to continue that trend line is not necessarily reliable.
But they're not continuing that trend line, are they? Because in the previous plan, 2013 to 2020, 66% of their supply was windfalls. That's the figures in the plan. Now, for this plan, they're only relying on 27% of the supply from windfalls. So it's not quite true to say the trend is continuing.
How are you defining a private site, sir?
Sorry?
How are you defining a private site?
I'm talking about we're talking about the supply, the windfall supply, whether they're windfalls, whether they're open market or not. The fact of the matter is now only 27% of their supply figure is open market housing.
You're adding up the 600 and the 500 in
Yes.
table H1.
Yeah.
And it's against an admittedly larger target, sir. The 4,150 obviously represents, as you say, getting on for 800 rather than the 400 that has been historically achieved. So,
But for a shorter period of time.
and that's part of the problem, sir, because none of those sites are in the system as we speak. None of them have been assessed, and we're expecting them to come forwards, get assessed, get designed, get planning, and get built. That's quite a tall order.
But with a much lower reliance on windfalls, surely that points to the fact that the plan is likely, more likely than the previous plan, to be successful. And I know the previous plan, they haven't provided as many as they wanted, but it was pretty close. Nearly 80% of the houses that they were seeking to provide in the previous plan were provided. So I'm struggling to understand the logic of your argument.
If there is to be a deliberate ramping up of houses built, which seems to be the sort of central intent, or one of the central intentions within the bridging plan, to rely upon sites coming forward, I'm not convinced is going to work. And I accept your maths in terms of saying it's a smaller proportion, but it's 100% of the market proportion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not convinced that you can seek to double your output by relying upon that measure, sir.
Okay. Well, then I just need to explore that a little more, the windfalls issue with the states. The previous plan seems to have been quite successful in relying on windfalls. What proportion of those windfalls came from development on the waterfront? Or was the waterfront not really a factor in those?
The waterfront there's a big chunk of supply that has come from the waterfront for St Helier. Don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I can provide you with the exact numbers on a per development basis. But currently we've got, I think, 280 flats being currently built on a development called Horizon. So that's a fairly large chunk of current under construction supply. And then previously under completed developments, we also had Castle Keys, which I think was around 380 units from the top of my head. Again, I'll have to give you a precise number if that's what you're after.
No, I'm not after the precise number.
Yeah, but in terms of proportion, it's a reasonable number, actually. It's a sort of, again, I'd have to work that out precisely what it is, because it's a bit nuanced in I'd have to look at the particular windfall for St Helier, then take the proportion of that figure against that total. So I can provide that for you I'd rather not guess what that is right now.
No, I understand. It's just what I'm trying to explore is how reliant you are on windfalls and how reliable that will be. And my point to Mr. Parker was, previously you had a huge proportion of your supply was windfalls, and actually it was successful. Now, if those windfalls, a lot of those windfalls came from the waterfront development, you're not going to get that over the planned period, because they're not anticipating much development, if any, in the waterfront, or not very much development on the waterfront in the bridging plan period. So that's what I'm trying to explore.
I understand, yeah, and also, I mean, it's not just the waterfront, which obviously was a large development within St Helier. We've had a large number of hotels being developed that are either currently under construction or have been developed over that period. Now, what we've done with our windfall figures going forwards is taken a more conservative approach and accepted that some of those larger sites are obviously no longer going to be available going forwards. So therefore, we've taken a kind of downward step in terms of the number going forwards, which obviously you've alluded to. Equally, there are some other sites that we know, beyond the next 5-year plan period, where the waterfront again will deliver a large number of homes. Yeah. So in the longer term, again, it's going to be a kind of principal source of new supply. But I don't think that will come out in the next 5 years, which is why we have a reasonably conservative approach to windfall, albeit, I think, something that will still be deliverable.
Okay.
Yes, okay. I mean, I was just wondering how much that was informed from the call for sites.
The call for
that 600 figure for the town capacity.
For the town capacity. No, we undertook a specific town capacity study, which looked at specific sites that were either a combination of government-owned sites or sites that we were aware of within our own portfolio, but also sites that we had conversations with the industry around as well, in terms of expert knowledge of sites that may or may not come forward in the next few years.
Is that in the database? Is that the character assessment study that you referred to in your state's response didn't really, to me, go into that in any detail at all, and give really, looking at it cold, I couldn't find any idea really what capacity in town was from that study. Is that a fair comment?
I mean, the overall number is based on it's based on specific site analysis we did, but also combining it with that worked from the character area study that gave us an idea of density levels that we might expect to receive through the new guidance that document's giving us, but also on average build rates that we know that have been completed within town over the last number of years. And as I said, we've just given it a kind of a conservative figure, which is sort of a proportion of that previous higher number, to kind of give us it is a guesstimate, because ultimately a windfall thing is not something that we zone for.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be an element of understanding what that figure might be going forwards. But we believe we've put in a conservative figure that again we believe we can deliver through previous experience of sites coming forward.
Right.
The hotel sites you talked about, of course, you're trying to adopt a slightly tougher policy with the hotels and trying to retain hotels more. Is that a fair comment?
I think, sir, it's clearly an issue for discussion that we will have when we discuss the Economy Day, but I think, as my colleagues indicated, the tourism industry in Jersey has been going through structural change for probably about 25 years, moving from a mass market tourism to a much more short break, niche type product, and that's obviously had an implication for the amount of bed stock that we require on the island. So we have seen over a period of decades probably hotel accommodation coming out of hotel use, and that has been exacerbated by things like Brexit and the impact of the pandemic on the hospitality sector. So I think there is a concern at large that government may wish to take a role in terms of managing that potential impact on that sector of the economy, and of course the relevance of that for provision of homes is the availability of those potential sites for housing. What I would say, however, is the test that we're looking to introduce is not an absolute prohibition against change of use of hotel sites. It's effectively a market test, and just a test to see whether there is any demand for a potential hotel site to remain in tourism use rather than coming out of that use before it goes into another use, which may be residential. So we're not seeking to preclude change of use of hotel sites, we're just seeking to test whether it's appropriate to have some form of regulation through the planning system to do that. So we still anticipate that there will be hotel sites coming forward, particularly those in if I can say, the lower end of the market. So those larger 2- and 3-star hotels, rather than the upper end 4- and 5-star hotels, which is where Jersey's tourism market is moving to. So we still anticipate some supply coming from that sector. And as my colleagues alluded to, in Jersey we certainly in terms of open market accommodation, we have tended not to use specific allocations in Jersey as a planning tool. We tend to use our built-up area boundaries as a way of generating development opportunities within our urban centres. And as we suggest, the historical trend of that is such that we've been very successful in both delivering development opportunities, but also successfully delivering our spatial strategy, which has been set out in previous island plans, which seeks to focus development within the built-up areas, get more efficient use of land, and focus development activity on those sites that are already developed by trying to encourage their redevelopment and increase their density and increase their yield. So, as we've suggested, we feel reasonably confident that those built-up area boundaries can continue to deliver those development opportunities.
Okay, Mr. Parker wants to come
Mr.
back.
Parker?
Thank you, sir. That solution is in itself part of the problem. It has been very successful. The thing with intensifying density is you tend to build smaller dwellings. They tend to be 1- and 2-bedrooms. Now, according to the Bridge and Island Plan, if you look at the plan just below policy H3, it sets it out there. 69% of the need within market housing is for 3 and 4 bedroom housing. 92% of the need for social housing is 1 and 2 beds. So what is being brought forward is a policy of where we know we need family housing, which tends to imply gardens. We're going to put that in the intense, dense areas, and when we know we need 1 and 2 bedrooms, we start to zone sites outside. It's back to front to an extent. If the plan seriously wants to hit the objective of family housing in the market sector, by and large, living in intensified urban environments isn't the right place.
I take the point and noted it, but actually what I was going to come on to, if that's, unless you want to go back to urban, we can come back to it, but was the rural windfall outside of town. Now that's still quite a significant number. It's 500, which might or might not include more family housing than the urban. Would you have any comment on that before I ask the states about that?
Sorry, in terms of location, I think that moving it beyond is welcome. I'm always very suspicious of round numbers.
Well.
There's a lot of round numbers in table H1, which worry.
I think a fair comment. In fact, Cyril, that was my next question really to the states in terms of, where's that figure come from? In terms of call for sites, for example, possibly, or is it, past trends? I notice, I think this is right, over the period of the previous plan, 2011 to 2020, there were 1,600 rural windfalls, of which 1,300, so roughly 60% or more, 2/3 were in the urban area of the rural areas, within the built-up settlement boundaries of the rural areas. Any comments on that aspect of supply?
Yeah, can I also go back to just as a point on your first question about windfall for St Helier, just as an illustration as well, because we're talking, was it 600 over the period, which was 125 a year on average or something like that. I mean, since the plan is, since we did the plan drafting in June, we've already had one hotel come through for approval, which alone was 107 units. So in terms of expectations and so on, that's one site that's delivered nearly what we think could have on average deliver in St Helier, for example.
What sort of units were they, going back to Mr. Parker?
So yeah, and Mr. Parker, and he makes a valid point, and so we've obviously got within the policy a policy within the plan to look at mix of housing and size of housing. So on that particular example on that site, some 3-bed units were part of the mix requirement that went into that site. So it's predominantly 1 and 2 bedrooms, but actually there is some family larger units that have gone into that site as well, and that will be that's part of an existing policy we have that we can use now, and it's there to be used, and it's based on evidence of need. So it's against the gate. In that example, that's the housing gateway evidence, where it's for affordable housing at that site, and so therefore that was the mix requirement against the current gateway, for example. So there is a mechanism in place and policies in place to make the mix of housing meet the demand that is recognised across the plan. In terms of the green zone, the rural developments, on average, I think we've looking at the figures, it's something like 130 units per year is our average delivery of units in the rural areas, and so we've taken a figure of 100, which again is sort of a lower average going forwards. So that's the sort of that's the background to that figure, and that's why it's a rounded figure. And I accept, for the arguments I previously put forward, that it is something that we haven't got any precise control or detail over, but it's something that we feel is a reasonable number based on previous delivery rates in those sorts of areas.
Can I just ask you about the... Sorry, can I just ask you about the cushion you have between supply and demand? Because you've had fewer completions than you anticipated, the cushion has actually shrunk.
Yeah.
So you have a smaller cushion now. Previously, you had a cushion which was about just over 10%. You're down to just under 4%.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with such a small cushion? Or should we be thinking of saying, actually, because you've had fewer completions, you need a little more allocation, you need some more allocations for the future?
Yeah, I mean, the reason it's gone down is it's when you're doing supply figures, it's obviously a point in time. And so we anticipated at the end of 2020 a large number of, particularly the affordable housing from the Andium delivery agency would come in that period. And through various delays in, use the Brexit word, and COVID and everything else, there's been a shift in supply from what was previously expected to be delivered in 2020 that's now going to be delivered in 21 and in some cases 22. So there's been a kind of a knock-on effect in terms of supply. So what that does, it then shifts that kind of point where you measure and what's happening with the supply number versus the demand number. But converse to that, then you'd expect that missed supply to then come into the plan period further down the track. So it would balance out. So I accept your argument that 10%, and anything less than 10% is probably a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you would probably look to mitigate that number to a higher comfortable figure through additional supply sources, absolutely. But the reason for that reduction, if you like, in that gap, I think it's just literally down to timing of delivery of supply.
Okay. Jeff, you want to do this?
Not on Windfall, I don't think we can take that any further, can we? We've got stuff on allocations. Unless anyone's got maybe open it for anywhere on Windfall, and then we go on.
Can we just ask Andy and Holmes, because obviously it's your whole existence, the provision of homes. Do you have a view about this situation with reliance on windfalls? I know there's a lot of reliance. Obviously, we're talking about open market housing, but clearly for your purposes, you were previously competing on windfall sites in the open market.
And I suppose to some extent we still do. We bought a couple of former hotel sites, for instance.
But if the plan, can you put your mic on? If the plan is adopted, then you won't be relying on windfall so much. You will actually have site allocations.
Yes, and certainly the ability to be able to deal with sites which have been specifically zoned for an affordable housing, for us is a real advantage. And we're not the only player in the market, of course. There are the housing trusts who also provide affordable housing, although not necessarily the purchase element of it. So it certainly is an additional tool in the box for us that allows us to develop the numbers of homes that we've committed to develop, and we've set out we will deliver 3,000 new homes by 2030 without the need to go to the market and compete with other developers, which clearly allows those sites to be developed for open market housing rather than being affordable. And the point we make in our submission is also we've got potential for sites which might be coming from surplus government use too, which are another way of augmenting the affordable housing supply that we want to deliver. But we are out there in the marketplace because those other options are not open to us at the moment. We haven't got the sites, and not to prejudge that the plan is going to be approved as drafted. We are out there doing what we can in order to deliver the affordable housing that the Gateway needs.
Okay, and can I just ask the states, because it did seem to me that one of the queries that we have and one of the slight areas of concern that we have is that a lot of the sites, the government sites, or at least several of the government sites that you talk about, are still in active use. And we all know that slippage can happen and delays can happen. So how confident are you about the supply from those government sites?
Well, this is my area actually. So we've recently developed a property strategy, which has been adopted by the government. We've also, from a governance point of view as well, established a sort of senior officer team that makes clear recommendations, that goes through the political process in terms of approval of sites. We're doing active asset management planning now of our existing portfolio to understand what the vacancy areas are and when those sites will come on stream. There've been a couple of major projects which have now indicated what sites might be released, so we've got greater certainty, particularly around our hospital project, which is obviously the health estate portfolio is quite a significant one, and there's some outworn sites that will arrive from that, and I think we indicate those in the Bridging Island plan. And so we are actively now in discussions with moving those sites forward. Certainly there is going to be some existing uses on some of those sites still, and as we indicate again in the Bridging Island plan, they might fall outside of the period of our current supply period, so beyond 2025. But the number that I think we have in the plan of 425 from the top of my head is still
That's right.
achievable.
425 is the number.
Yeah. So that's still achievable based on the sites that we've got coming forwards. We've also recently about to sign a development agreement with Andium on a property called The Limes, which is going to deliver 127, is it, units. So that's hopefully going to then get start the development of that, I think, next year, with completion in 24, I think, from the top of my head again. So we are I understand in the past, with uncertainty around a lot of our estate because of big ticket items like our hospital project, we've got a new One Go office as well happening. That's been now confirmed happening for 2024 delivery. So there is a greater certainty around that sort of pipeline of state-owned sites to come forward.
You refer to the hospital project, but that's unlikely, isn't it, to be providing a supply of housing sites for presumably redundant medical facilities and hospital facilities
the actual hospital
within the planned period?
Yeah, absolutely. The hospital itself absolutely won't come forward between now and 2025. But there's other elements of it that are outworn and that can come forward. So, for example, we've got Westway Court, which is old nursing home accommodation, which is likely to come forward. We've got parts of St Saviour's Hospital, which are due to be released as they repurpose some of that site. As well, that there's a northern part that will be retained for existing health use, but there's bits of it within the southern part which will certainly come forwards. There's an ambulance station site as well, bearing in mind, but there's some decisions around where that moves to, which is we've currently got some work underway at the moment, which will conclude that particular site hopefully in the next month or two. So you're right, the major kind of jewel in the crown of the hospital itself won't be a kind of a reality on supply until probably the late 20s.
And clearly there's been a time lapse between when the plan was actually drafted and today.
Yeah.
And so you can reassure us, can you, that actually the assumptions built into the plan about these government sites coming forward, those still remain valid today in the light of what decisions that have been made between when the plan was drafted and today?
Yeah, I probably can actually say I'm more assured, actually, because there were certain decisions that hadn't quite been made back in the drafting period in March and April.
Okay.
That we can't. Yeah. So more assurance is probably the way I'd go.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Well done. We're moving on to someone's turn.
Andy and Holmes.
Just a point on that. I think we'll make a very good point that some of those sites are still in use and have operational uses. One of the points that Andrew's made and we talk with government about is that if we can make decisions that those sites are going to be released at some point when the operational use ceases, Andium's inherent relationship with government means that actually if we have certainty over the sites, there's no reason why we can't get on with the development work, the planning activity, so that when those sites come out of operational use, the lag in terms of time between the site ceasing to be in operational use and actually being developed is as short as possible. I think that's what we want to try and avoid, is sites sitting dormant for long periods of time when they could be delivering economic activity and ultimately delivering homes for us.
Okay. Can I just explore a question with you? This question of third-party appeals, which the Chamber told us this morning is a significant problem, and causes a problem of delivery. Will that apply to government sites which are brought forward for housing? Will people be able to object to those sites as third parties?
Yes. So the provision is at large generally. So if somebody's made a representation in relation to a planning application, and that planning application is approved, then a third party is able to submit an appeal. There are some parameters within that, and testing my knowledge now, but I think they have to have an interest within 50 metres of the site. Certainly that was the case originally. But that right is at large, so it applies to any development site.
That's been built into the assumptions that you put into your supply figures, presumably. I don't know how you would do that, but I'm asking you whether you did it or not.
We haven't really taken into account the potential for delay arising from appeals, but it is a factor of the planning system in Jersey. The island's government have made that decision that islanders should enjoy that right, and obviously it cuts both ways. There's a first party appeal as well built into our planning system.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
We'll look at allocations. Is that on your list?
No. You want to pick it up?
Yeah, briefly.
Yeah.
Okay, well the final element, I think, in the supply position is the rezoning, the allocations for affordable housing. And there was a question raised this morning about implementation and delivery of those. But first of all, we've got two of those have dropped out, I think, at the moment. Are there any more that you're aware of that have dropped out? There's the Longville Nursery, wasn't there, and the one in St Martin's, which I made about. We've got ranges here. That's roughly 50 dwellings, isn't it?
Yes, between 41 and 61 dwellings will be lost as a result of those two sites coming out of the plan.
And then we've got the Plan B sites, which we're going to talk about tomorrow afternoon and Wednesday, which they total about 388, I think. Is that right? Roughly? Well, it's a broad figure. Have the states got anything to say to us about how they might look to replace the 50 or so that have already been lost? Question one.
I think the Minister's set out in his statement response how he might consider those. So the Minister's keen to ensure a distribution of housing sites that reflects the categorisation that he's applied to the housing sites. So he's looked at things like strategic extensions to main urban centres, and then suburban extensions, and then extensions to local centres. And the Minister's, if, for example, we took all the States Members' amendments, for example, we could simply accept all of the States Members' amendments, and that may resolve a lot of the challenges. However, the Minister's concerned to ensure that we secure the most sustainable pattern of development, so the Minister would be minded to look to replacements that fall into a similar categorisation. So I think in the case of the site in St Martin, that was obviously a rural extension, so we'd look to replace that with another rural extension. The site in St Saviour was, I think we classified that as a suburban extension, so the Minister would look to replace it with that. So I think that's part of the position in terms of the potential replacement of sites zoned for affordable homes.
A couple more points on that then. On that list of allocations, how did that reflect the spatial strategy rather than the housing needs requirements from, for example, waiting lists. But when you created that list, actually they're quite well spread about, aren't they? In terms of geographic dispersion. I mean, for example, St Martin's. Do we know that there's a bigger demand in St Martin's than, say, St Trinity or any of the other villages compared to St Helier and St Saviour? How was that factored into the allocation process and how the way you chose the sites?
Yeah, we don't have any specific evidence that's related to individual parishes. Some parishes have done some work to look at their housing need with their constituents. We've had no sort of control over that. They've just used that as a basis to test with their constituents whether there's a need to provide homes to support their parish communities. And we've engaged with the parishes throughout the preparation of the draft plan. We've assessed the sites from an island-wide planning perspective, so we've sought to make provision that meets island-wide need for homes, but we've sought to respond to those identified requirements where it's been communicated to the Minister by the parishes that there is an aspiration to provide new homes in those parishes, and the Minister's responded to that, but he's done so in a way that seeks to use planning criteria to assess that, rather than just simply the fact that a parish has expressed an aspiration to deliver more homes. We've sought to, through the use of the call for sites, to identify land that's come forward, where there's a realistic opportunity of that land being deliverable within the planned period, and then sought to test those call for sites against set planning criteria to determine how we might respond to that aspiration.
Okay, well that's one of the aspects we'll be looking at all those criteria starting tomorrow afternoon for both the allocated sites and the Plan B sites, and possibly other sites, Plan C sites. Okay, well, the other question that was raised, I think, by Jersey Farmers Union this morning was the price cap or the means of deliverability. We've had some issues with these two sites have dropped out. Now maybe they've dropped out because the landowners think they might want to wait and try and get market housing on them. And in the plan itself, you do talk about other measures like CPO considerations to try and make sure that the allocations are delivered. Is that likely? How's that mechanism likely to be effected, if you like? How's it going to come about?
In terms of the provisions that the states have to affect compulsory purchase, clearly the plan in the policy talks about a policy mechanism to pursue compulsory purchase if sites don't come forward. That would need to be the subject of then a separate state's decision to pursue compulsory purchase provisions to secure those sites. But
would it need legislation?
Well, there's legislation in place to do that. That's right. Yeah. So, but I think we've undertaken a call for sites process. We would anticipate that all of those sites that remain within the plan have got landowners who are willing to bring their sites forward for development within the plan period. As you rightly identify, a couple of landowners have for whatever reason now withdrawn their sites, but the sites that remain in the draft plan, as far as we understand, landowners are still willing to bring those forward. Likewise, those that we've identified.
That's my understanding. So at the moment,
and likewise those that we've identified in Plan B and on the Plan B list, if I can call it those, all of those, there's just one where there's a question mark over the willingness of the landowner to bring a site forward. And then clearly those sites that are in Appendix 3, clearly we've got landowners who are actively seeking their sites to be put into the plan. So we would assume that, again, if they were to be brought forward, then we would assume the landowners would have no hesitation in bringing them forward.
So the sites that you have initially allocated for affordable housing, landowners have withdrawn them. They come forward for housing, for open market housing. They would then fall into the windfall category that Mr. Parker is worried about.
I think in both of those cases, the land is outside our built-up area boundaries, so they'd effectively fall within a policy regime where the provision of new homes would not be encouraged. They would struggle if the plan is adopted with its planning policy context set out at the moment to secure development consent on those sites. They may choose to come forward in the subsequent island plan review, of course, but that's a matter for another day.
So why wouldn't they fall into the windfalls outside of town category?
Should they get planning consent, then they would fall into the windfalls, but I suppose the point I'm making is that the policy presumption is against the provision of homes on those sites because they would be deemed to be outside of the built-up area.
Outside the built-up area.
Yeah. No, I understand that, but of course you've got an element of 500 open market windfalls outside of the built-up area, outside of town. You're distinguishing between the built-up area and town.
We are. In terms of that other source of supply, we would envisage most of that supply coming from other built-up areas outside of the town of St Helier. So if you look historically at our level of approvals for the countryside, so for areas outside of the built-up area, that's very small. There's a policy presumption against the provision of new homes in the countryside, if you like. So we would, so that source of supply is from built-up area boundaries outside of the town of St Helier. And I think picking up on one of the points that you made earlier around the issue of provision of homes versus flats, if we look historically over the current plan period, we've delivered something like, it's getting towards about 40% of open market completions have been houses, 60% have been flats, and a lot of those houses would have been provided in those built-up area boundaries outside of the town of St Helier. So, we can point to schemes where land has come forward to provide family homes in smaller urban centres around the island.
But you also have an aspiration, let's call it an aspiration, to have more family homes within the built-up, within St Helier, within developments, apartment developments that we were talking about, an element in schemes, 400, 120 houses. You would, as a planning authority, be pushing for an element of family housing in those sorts of schemes.
That's right. So I think we have seen a number of schemes come forward over the current plan period where there may have been a predominance of 1 and 2 bed units, perhaps to the exclusively 1 and 2 bed units. I think our concern is to ensure that we get more mixed accommodation and more mixed communities on some of those schemes. Therefore, we've got policy provision in the plan where we would seek to ensure that we have a tool that we can seek to ensure the provision of more family accommodation, even if that is within more compact forms of development. So we see no reason why flatted accommodation shouldn't be provided for families with the requisite internal space as well as external amenity space as well.
Yeah. Mr. Parker, did you want to come back? You've got your...
Yes, please, sir.
Just very quickly picking up on that last point before I go to the point I wanted to make. My experience of providing 3-bedroom flats rather than houses, it can work in the affordable housing sector because, frankly, a lot of those people don't have the degree of choice which others might have. But in providing family homes within a dense apartment complex where there's no garden and shared public amenity space. They tend not to be as popular in the open market, in my experience. While statistically you might be saying that you're going to provide some 3-beds, I'm not convinced that's actually responding to the need for family homes. The point I was going to make was about the zoned sites within the fact that I think the states are now proposing to remove the 55-45 tenure split. Now, obviously, if it becomes more homes for sale designated as affordable, that would tend to generate a higher land value for landowners, whereas if it's affordable housing for rent, that tends to generate a lower value.
Yeah.
So I'm just questioning, so that if that calculation goes one way, the landowner will probably still be happy to proceed. If the calculation goes the other way, and we've got, from the wording that's been put forward, it would appear to put all control, for that matter, in the hands of the states, then you stand a chance of having disgruntled landowners in terms of the zone site. So I'm not convinced the removal of that backstop position is going to be terribly helpful in terms of achieving the numbers that are set out in H1.
So, as I understand it, what the Minister is wanting to do is to remove the set figures that have been drafted into the plan and have a more flexible approach, and saying, well, we'll look at each site on its own merits and decide what the proportion should be. I think that's the approach that the states want to adopt.
Yes, sir. But
and you were unhappy about that?
Well, I think a large number of people will be unhappy. So, I mean, the planning system, if anything, is to help deliver some certainty going forward in the negotiations. And if what you know is that your site is going to be developed, but you've got no chance of making a calculation as to the value that would attract, until you actually get into the detailed negotiations about the likely tenure split, that may not be as attractive to some landowners as the guarantee of the 55-45 situation, and especially if they're then being threatened with CPO.
Can I ask you, from Andean Homes, what's your experience of negotiating to buy sites? Is that going to be a problem?
We actually, in our submission to the draft plan, argued against 45-55, which seemed to us to be a step back to the 2002 Island Plan position, which clearly put the first-time buyer elements of the sites in dominance, clearly delivered more value, but from our point of view failed to recognise that we were, as part of our asset strategy at Andean, selling 60 of our homes a year, so 600 over a full 10-year period, which we didn't think had been factored into the supply, and crucially for us, those homes that we former rental homes that we sell to first-time buyers need to be replaced in order that we can keep the rental stock at least in a neutral position. So I think what we proposed initially was to maintain the status quo from the the revised 2011 Island Plan, which was an 80-20 in favour of rental, which still introduced an element of first-time buyer onto sites, which enhanced the value and actually made negotiations much more straightforward. Having the fixed proportions puts everyone knows where they stand, and so the way that we calculate value on a residual basis is reasonably well understood, and our experience has been that's been a reasonable way forward. Having an open-ended site-by-site arrangement, we can see would bring some complications in terms of at what point you can agree that position and the transparency of it, so that when you do sit down with the landowner and negotiate, you both need to be on reasonably the same page. So our proposal was certainly for the 80-20 kind of status quo. I don't see how the open-ended couldn't be made to work, again, if we can agree at the outset what the proportions are going to look like. But of course, as we all know, the gateway demand changes and can be quite sensitive to what's going on economically. The availability of mortgage finance is clearly an issue that we see with potential buyers, and so we do need to have some flexibility. So I do understand where the Minister's arrived at his position in order that it allows flexibility going forward.
So, but when you're doing your negotiating, presumably if we have this flexibility in the policy, the negotiations have to take that into account and possibly say, well, you know, if the proportions are X, then the value of the site is Y. If the proportions are A, the value of the site is B.
And it's possible to do that.
And that's what
it's
you
more
have
complicated.
to do. It's more, of course, it's more complicated, but the chartered surveyors will love it.
I mean, one way of dealing with it is certainly in terms of development briefs, as the sites are approved. The development criteria for the sites will be set out in a development brief. That's the historic way that we've done these things. And if those proportions can be fixed, then I think when you sit around the negotiating table with a landowner, you're on the same page, and you can have an open discussion about values, because the value of social rented, as we've already said, tends to deliver a lower land value than the first-time buyer. But I think it is a point that you can. The sooner you can start negotiating, the sooner you can start doing the detailed planning work, the sooner you can deliver the homes, and the development briefs in that sense are absolutely crucial. And I think it's a point we made in our response, is getting those development briefs out the door very quickly helps everybody to move on, and then if we can't reach a position with the negotiation, that's when the compulsory purchase arrangements might well come into play.
Yeah, okay, all right. Mrs. Day.
Thank you. I think it's useful to raise that the issue of benchmark land value and compulsory purchase has been raised in the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel's recommendations made just only last week. Excuse me. In there, they make a recommendation that we consider the implementation of a benchmark land value, and that also we prioritise the publication of compulsory purchase guidance, which would help to explain when and how we would look to apply the Minister's powers from the law. First and foremost, without prejudging any response to that report, which the Minister for the Environment, together with the Minister for Housing and Communities, will make in due course, the consideration of a benchmark land value would have to be subject to a full and proper assessment, which, as you know, we would already be doing work similar to that in the consideration of a sustainable communities fund, where we would be having to look at land values particularly closely. If benchmark land value were to be a proposed direction, we would have to first undertake that work to establish what value that may be. Second of all, the compulsory purchase guidance may well not be a bad idea to help landowners to understand when and how those powers may be used. And I think also the point made by Mr. Parker is a good one, that by removing the certainty in the plan as to the proportion of homes for affordable purchase or rent will make the negotiation of sites a lot more difficult. And of course we've responded to the request of Andium Homes to provide flexibility, because there's the balance of the need to provide the right type of homes, but we also need to make sure that the negotiation on the land sale is actually successful. So there is an argument there that we need to introduce a degree of certainty to ensure that the negotiation can happen. In terms of what we do to come out of that situation, the alternative is to produce guidance in the most timely fashion. There's a reality that guidance takes time to produce. The Island Plan team obviously working very hard to produce the draft plan. As soon as that is adopted, we will look to produce supplementary planning guidance on the affordable housing sites as a matter of priority. However, there is a reality that we are into an election, a purdah period, a re-establishing of the Council of Ministers, a new Minister for the Environment, that may not arrive in the weeks immediately following the draft plan, and there is a risk that could come in the months, which would be eating into the plan delivery period.
Okay, thank you. Well, good luck with establishing benchmark land values. That's an interesting discussion that we have in England on when you're doing civil examinations. You hear plenty of that, and I'm sure Mr. Spry could tell us all about that. Right. Anybody else wants to say anything on land and supply? We've got 3 people. Right. Yes, sir. You are?
My name is Charlie Mallet de Carteret. I am on the Council of the National Trust for Jersey and been looking at the plan with Karen and Charles. Just a few words, if I can, just to step back perhaps from some of the detail that's been talked about this afternoon, because I think we've got a more fundamental problem with the numbers being bandied about here in terms of the absolute numbers, 4,150 houses, 10% more houses than exist at the moment in Jersey over the plan period. It's an extraordinarily aggressive house building programme that seems to be taken as without too much debate. And it's very surprising in a number of levels, particularly in the lack of knock-on effects that apply to the environment and the infrastructure required to support such a huge building programme. The island plan, the Bridging Island plan, alludes to those, but is very light on the detail and the costs and the economic consequences of what's being proposed. So that's been particularly context to inflation and construction costs and labour shortages that we're experiencing at the moment and can only get worse as a result of this programme. What's a little concerning to us is the way that these numbers have been put together. Based on the OAHN, I understand that's a very valid document, but the statistics contained in it are very old. 2015 is the statistics. It's a 2018 report, November 2018, issued in January 2019. It's already 3 years old, and does not take into account clearly the impacts of COVID and Brexit and the anecdotal stories that we hear in the paper every day of shortages of labour, which means that people are no longer here to do the work required in all sectors. Anecdotally, we've heard that there's between 2,000 and 4,000 fewer tax returns submitted this year compared to last. Where have these people gone? What impact does this have on the numbers that are being bandied around today? We have some serious reservations about the methodology that's gone into these numbers, the numbers. Second point, perhaps, is to say that the OAHN report that everyone is talking so much about acknowledges that government has a huge ability to influence the outcomes. I was very surprised to hear the government's plans of plus 700 immigration numbers being described as very sort of optimistic, very gentle. I think that's a hugely aggressive stance to take when it's within government's ability to reduce those. It's not today's job this is the government's job to work out what the population policy is. We can't possibly put up a solution, but it seems cart before the horse to be having a numbers hard baked into a planning document before the population and migration policy has been debated in the government. Last but least, on the numbers side, the Island Plan contains many references, and I counted them. It's over 400 references to sustainable, and that's a great word to be using. But it's the context in which it's being used that I find a little harder to understand. Much is talked about sustainable development, and I'm not sure that anyone has really measured the Island Plan against what is sustainable development as defined in the UN Brundtland report. I think there's a lot of talk and hot air about sustainability, and it's simply not being addressed by this house building programme. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on a sustainable house building programme, which is, and just to remind you what sustainable development is, it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that's what sustainable development is, and that's the definition of sustainable development. This is not what was being proposed in the island plan, where the future generations are going to suffer the consequences of the proposals here. I think, interestingly, the scrutiny panel report yesterday, it came up with a number of helpful ideas and suggestions, not least of which on the statistical problem that I mentioned earlier. Their suggestion was that the OAHN needs to be brought forward and updated and made usable, made public and transparent and usable by developers and government and everyone else. And that's a terrific idea, because one of the problems that we've had looking at the numbers is we're comparing apples and pears, different dates, different bodies we have. We have OAHN, we have Statistics Jersey, we have the Housing Gateway, all with different numbers, all with different reporting periods, virtually impossible to tie together the numbers that everyone's been talking about. So having a list, a spreadsheet, with the demand at the top and the supply at the bottom, and matching the two by, particularly by the housing mix, which we've talked about a lot today. Mr. Buchholz referred to 3-bedroom units being developed in one of the hotel developments. He's right, there were 7 of them, but there were, at the same time, there were 99 1- and 2-bedroom units in the Revere hotel development, and in the Mayfair, which is even more recent, there's 200 1- and 2-bedroom units, 0 3-bedrooms. So the housing mix is really, really important, and the way that we are, that the planning committee is approving housing allocations takes no account of the mix of the houses that people want to live in, and the affordable housing gateway is really helpful in describing people's aspirations for living in larger properties, and that's a real problem, I think, for what we're doing here. That's probably enough from me, but
yeah, I just want to come back to you on a couple of things on that. I mean, what we've really got here, you've just quite neutrally, so you're raising 4,000 new homes, right? That's your concern over 5 years. 2,000 of those are already committed, aren't they? In terms of the under construction or existing planning permissions. So that leaves 2,000, of which the best part of 1,000, 875 are affordable homes. So, I mean, are you saying that, that of the 2,000 that we can't really get rid of the committed ones? Are you saying we should be seriously looking at reducing the number of affordable homes that are being proposed in this plan?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying because it's so hard to work out. It really is comparing apples and pears with the 4,150 number against houses under construction, and it's very, very hard to work out what the actual need is. And if the actual need is 2,000 less, well, that should be the number that's of new houses proposed.
Okay, well that goes back to the migration assumption figure, essentially, doesn't it, of the 700. Plus the 100 natural increase.
There are some arithmetic issues in there. There's a 7%. There's a 7% contingency, for example, which is not explained.
We've made a note. Do you want to ask any more points about that?
I'd just like to explore your approach a little more, because you described the 700 migration as aggressive. But it's actually quite modest in comparison to what has happened over every year for the last 10 years.
Well, now we're getting into political.
Well, it may be political, but that those are people who come in who want homes.
Which isn't my job, because
so your description of aggressive. So I think the states would say, well, actually, it's a cautious approach, not an aggressive approach.
It's cautious compared to what has happened, but in the absence of any migration policy for the last 10 years.
Yeah. Well, we are where we are. So they have to base it on some sort of figures.
I agree with you. We are where we are, and that has led to a backlog. And I think
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear that people talk about the backlog being dealt with over 10 or even 5 years. I mean, a backlog is a problem today which should be dealt with today.
Lovely. Well, I'm sure lots of people would want to do that, but how do you build 1,800 houses today?
We just said that 2,000 are under construction.
2050.
So
Yeah, but there's not only a backlog need, there's a present need. And the point you made was you said, well, we've got to think about the needs of the future generations when we're talking about sustainable, but we also have to think about the needs of the present generation, and that's what the plan seems to us to be trying to do, trying to assess what the current needs are and how do we best meet those. And isn't that a legitimate approach for them to take?
No, it is, but I mean, it's so difficult to know what the real demand is. I mean, the housing gateway, for example, is probably what the closest thing to the actual demand last month of 2,490 houses, of which 483 are urgent.
Yeah.
And that's an embarrassing and shocking figure.
It is.
And yet, if you look at Statistics Jersey's numbers, they're completely different. If you look at the OHN numbers, so there's at least 3 different sources of housing need numbers. Very difficult to pull them together and to understand. And the scrutiny's idea of putting them all together in one big bucket that everyone can look at and agree on would be really sensible.
Do you accept that the population growth and the state of the economy on the island are directly related?
Yes, I do. And that leads to a much wider debate because the principle of growth is hard baked into the OAHN numbers and indeed into government policy. I think that is being debated at the moment. In particular, the last couple of weeks there's been some interesting articles by Jonathan Renouf and others questioning whether that strategy has been successful or not, and whether or not it's actually time for a reset on that policy. That's not a matter for me or indeed this panel.
So we're back now to this.
But it's a big debate, which for me, getting this island plan agreed before the
but that's why it's a bridging plan. That's why it's not their long-term plan.
Well, it's doing quite a lot of damage.
You think it's doing damage? But you did also say that it was really very important that we got the housing mix right.
Yes.
And that you need family houses as well as small 1- and 2-bedroom units. So do you support Mr. Parker's view that if you actually need family houses, the need is for family houses, you need to actually allocate sites outside of the built-up area for open market housing?
It's not, family houses are not incompatible with built-up areas.
No, okay. So your line, you would support the line taken by the states, is that we need a higher proportion of family homes within the built-up areas.
Well, no, density is a topic for I think tomorrow's.
It is,
and that's a wider question. I think I don't think we've been very good about thinking about urban housing rather than urban flat design. We see lots of the 2 hotel projects we just talked about are 1- and 2-bedroom monolithic blocks of flats, and if that's what's been passed, we objected to them at the time. But there's other ways of designing houses, and as we've spoken with Andy, there's all sorts of ways that interesting urban housing projects can be put together.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Parker.
Thank you, sir. Just 2 housekeeping questions, if I may. We sort of strayed into the area of tenure mix. Am I right in thinking we'll debate that at length tomorrow rather than today?
Yes, we can debate that tomorrow. Yep.
And then benchmark land values were mentioned, sir. Am I right in thinking that's not a matter for you, but for the emerging next plan?
Not a matter. Well, it's not a matter that we've given any sort of thought to. We haven't seen anything about it.
Thank you, sir.
Right, somebody else was wanting to say something. Yes, sir.
Andrew again.
Yeah.
I'd like to support, sir, the comment that my colleague, Peter, the Major Chairman of the Farmers Union, made this morning, and that was when he used the word affordability. I think I've heard the word affordable. I don't know how many times I've heard it in the last hour and a half, but it's perhaps one of the most frequent words used, and I haven't had one thing with all the major players of the housing industry around this table tell us anywhere where we're going to be able to produce affordable homes in the future, other than let's build lots and lots and flood the market. And that's what governments aspired to do for the last 20 years and failed miserably. The big difference with this island plan, sir, is that it has, unlike the policies for the last 20 years, is it's looking to increase housing supply on agricultural land. That is a big difference for us, and I'm sure you understand why I feel strongly about it. And the farming industry has not said no over my dead body. We've recognised there is a huge housing problem in this island. The people we're talking about, was not, I think someone mentioned we don't know what the supply is. Well, we knew 12 months ago what the housing supply was, because young people queued for nearly 24 hours to get into an office to put their name down. So we know that demand is there. 15 of the 16 affordable housing sites are on the rural rezoned fields. Talk has been made about hotels. A hotel in town has, as an area of property, has a definable value. No doubt if you sell it, it's worth more than if you try to sell it as a hotel. A field in the countryside is worth a maximum, generally speaking, of £10,000 of OG. And Mr. Parker will be able to tell me very quickly what that value is if it is rezoned for housing. It's not twice as much, it's not 10 times as much, it's hundreds times much. And apart from one site that is being rezoned in the countryside, which is owned by a farmer, I think I'm right in saying all the others are not owned by farmers, they are owned by landowners. And I think it's morally wrong that we can rezone with a system, as I showed you here this morning, which takes no account of the agricultural value of the land, how overnight that can be worth so much without having a policy for really getting to grips with affordable housing supply in this island. And so I'm very frustrated as a farmer that we're here taking a responsible view to try and allocate extra housing in less productive land, less strategically important land for an industry which continually throughout the island plan is referred to as being the gardens of the countryside. We like the countryside, we like the well-being of the countryside. We do all these things and we're proud to do them, and we're looking to do them better than we've done them in the past. And here we are sitting here and there's not an affordable home in sight, sir. Sorry to be pessimistic, but I am somewhat frustrated.
So what would your solution be?
My solution is that the uplift in the value of the rural sites for affordable homes shouldn't be the magnitude that is being proposed in the housing market. In the urban housing market. And I hear about 45, 55s and all these sort of things to increase the value. Increase the value to who?
Do the states have a view? It's a bit of a wide. It's a wide-ranging subject.
Yeah, and we certainly on behalf of the minister puts forward land, particularly agricultural land, for rezoning. He doesn't do that lightly, and I think it's a recognition of the fact that the position that we find ourselves in terms of seeking to make a response to the housing requirements that we have, that the minister's minded to consider the potential rezoning of agricultural land for this purpose. As Mr. Legale has indicated, most of the sites proposed for rezoning do affect agricultural land, and that is clearly something that's going to be impactful on the character of the countryside and the industry generally. But I think when we look at it as a proportion of the overall level of affordable housing land supply, it is a relatively small proportion of the overall supply. And as Mr. Mavati from Andium Homes indicated, there is a plan to deliver 3,000 affordable homes, much of which will come from sites within the urban area, as well as the potential support that these rezoned sites might give. We do acknowledge that it does affect agricultural land, and I think it's about 70 verges, or about 13 hectares of land that's likely to be affected by the proposed rezoning. That may change depending on the sites that come out or go into the plan, and it represents something like 0.2% of all cultivated land in the island. And that's not to belittle the impact. We recognise it will have an impact, and we try to take that into account as part of our assessment criteria. And as I say, we use planning criteria to assess the suitability of sites, and that includes their current use, but it also includes other planning factors like where they are in the island, what's their relationship to existing settlements, what landscape impact, etc., etc. And no doubt we'll get into the meat of that tomorrow and on Wednesday when we talk about specific sites. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Thank you. That's helpful. Anybody else? Right. Sorry, Senator Moore.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk briefly about political realities. As I was listening to Mr. Pilley list and refer to some of the Minister's suggestions, and I think he has responded to some of the amendments from my colleagues and ruled out many of the sites that have been proposed by myself and colleagues. He has now offered some alternatives, but then they have been ruled out by my colleagues. So we are very much looking forward to seeing your reflections after going through this process, and we're very grateful that you're here, and hope that you will be able to help us with some of those issues, because they aren't easy. In the past, I've brought propositions to the Assembly asking them to approve rezoning of sites to provide affordable homes. I did so in 2019. Those affordable homes would have been finished when we went into, well, certainly they would be finishing now. And with the recent problems that we've seen with families trying to hold down their jobs and educate their children in their homes during lockdown, we all have a much greater understanding of the importance of a good family home, a space within which a family can thrive, enjoy their life, their leisure time, but also now it appears increasingly their work time as well, which goes back to the question of space and what is the required amount of space. There is a lot of papering in this exercise. There are over 3,000 pages of documents, and myself, I haven't even touched the surface, I'm sure, with this island plan and all of the underpinning documentation that we have with it. But this is one question that is not within the plan, because it's actually very difficult to understand, because it's very new and there is very little evidence with which to base any assumptions. But it's important that we do find some assumptions, because timing at this stage is critical. Many people have suggested and mentioned today that we have families and people who are leaving the island currently because of the problems that they are experiencing in finding housing that they can afford, housing that affords them a good quality of life. And what I think is perhaps lacking in this Bridging Island plan, and it's supposed to be a temporary plan, is any opportunities to provide temporary accommodation or semi-temporary accommodation, because we actually do need some quick fixes. We really need some quick fixes if we're to turn around the tide of economic decline that we're seeing which is being caused by the problems of accessing housing and the anecdotal evidence that we have, but it is very strong evidence. I've spent hours this week standing on King Street talking to members of the public, and housing is one of the two key issues. The hospital is the other one, and we'll talk about that on another day. But the two key issues that people want to talk about, because it is affecting everyone, and it really is going to affect this island's future if we don't get it right now. So it's all well and good to talk about the potential for the hospital site to deliver homes after 2026, but we need some solutions, and we need to find some opportunities that provide hope and a future for everybody within a short period of time.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's a couple of points there that I think we are going to, and one of them touched on the National Trust point about sustainability and its definition, and part of that is making a sustainable future for island residents, in terms of affordable housing. So, that need that's a sustainable need, if you like. That's got to be provided for. On the agricultural land, we are going to be, that's one of the criteria that I'm looking at tomorrow and Mr. Holland will, when we go through the site. So we're going to be looking at sort of each of the sites that have been allocated, subject to objections, and the other ones. And our job is basically to try and weigh all these factors up in terms of deciding whether or not the council, the states, decisions have been the right ones in terms of the numbers of housing and where it should be, and the mix and all of that. I mean, it's all got to be just synthesised together, and part of that process is tomorrow. Is there anything you want to?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, Mrs. Smith.
I wasn't here this morning, so I missed the protocol about standing your sign up, so apologies. Claire Smith, I'm a planning lawyer.
Can you talk directly into the microphone? People
Sorry.
at the back can't hear you.
Sorry.
Try and speak up a bit.
Okay, Claire Smith, I'm a planning lawyer with KE Planning Limited. I just wanted to sound a note of caution on the ability to use compulsory purchase powers in the bridging island period, and the weight that you can give to policy that uses that as a fundamental plank. You may not be aware, sirs, that the compulsory purchase of land procedure, Jersey Law 1961, has no right to object, no ability to propose alternatives, and no right of appeal. And therefore, whilst guidance will assist with the equivalent of things like Critchell Down rules, you'll appreciate that the guidance alone won't make it sound from a human rights and principles of natural justice perspective, given that the exercise of any law is predicated on a right of appeal. So if the Minister proposes to begin to exercise this power more regularly against an unwilling landowner, it is highly likely to end up in the Royal Court, if not ultimately the Privy Council, and that is liable to take the entire plan period to obtain a final determination.
What a cheerful prospect.
Sorry, planning lawyer brings the whole thing down. Apologies, I'll just switch my microphone off now and leave.
Right, Mr. Spryer.
Thank you, sir. You made reference or a suggestion about talking about benchmark land values, which I assume was rhetorical rather than a direct sort of invitation. So
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You could go on all afternoon. I know. Don't worry.
Our point, sadly, is about viability matters, as I flagged this morning, and you'll have seen from our representations that a lot of the focus of that was around putting a sort of deeply sceptical marker down about the Sustainable Communities Fund and the affordable housing sort of obligations, provisions that are there as proposals. In terms of the debate this afternoon, I think the points we're making in that submission have implications more generally for the housing supply approach that we've been talking about this afternoon. And I'll just briefly explain why that is. So the tests that have been established for you around the plan has to be based on proportionate evidence and also to be capable of delivery. So to my mind, when we're looking at the housing supply figures that are presented before us, we need to have a clear sort of understanding that, you know, where they come from and the proportionate evidence behind them, and also that they are fundamentally capable of delivery. Now, insofar as viability goes, there are two bits of evidence supporting that, the viability of housing delivery in the plan. There's the 2017 viability report that was produced around the time of the Jersey infrastructure levy was being talked about, and then also 2021 update note. Now, back in 2017, when the infrastructure levy was being proposed, we made a number of submissions on that and criticisms of the report, and as far as we can see from looking at the 2021 update note, those criticisms haven't been satisfactorily addressed. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those criticisms, you've got them in writing, but in sort of very broad terms, there were points around that the assessment didn't take account of the structural differences that exist in Jersey in terms of both the land market and what motivates landowners to make their land available for development, about the, and I will say the words benchmark land value, but effectively about the existing use values that were being assumed because the viability study relied upon a 1.9 million per hectare figure based on industrial, when our evidence showed that's a huge sort of variation in actual values that were achieved. And then costs, because the study relied upon BCIS data, which is not statistically reliable for Jersey, and which our evidence suggested was underestimating costs here. And then there were short-term problems relating to COVID and Brexit deal issues. And, you know, it's interesting, the update note, para 5.8, admits that there are material uncertainties around viability linked to COVID and Brexit. And I think our submission is that that indicates it's the wrong time for this plan to be introducing extra costs on development in the absence of a proper evidence base that shows that they are consistent with viable development. So why does this matter? Well, we've heard this morning and this afternoon that spatial strategy is focused on the existing built-up area, and land assembly for the private sector is therefore more likely to be focused on having a residual residential value that outweighs the values for other uses, and does so in the context that policy generally is seeking to protect and maintain existing employment land for those uses. And for urban sites, that residual land value is going to be highly variable to the site specific. So, you know, what's the density of development? What are the specific build costs? What are the abnormals? Now, the Minister's statement response to the representations, which is pages 263 to 267, around the viability issues, but effectively makes 2 points. On the Sustainable Communities Fund and affordable housing, effectively it says, don't worry,
we'll do another one.
Those concerns are premature, they'll be tested and so on in due course. Now, in a sense, maybe fine. I think our concern is that the failure to address the methodological issues in the update note causes the Construction Council to have some scepticism as to how well those issues will be addressed when the government revisits those proposals down the line. And if there is to be a reference in the plan to those, question mark, does there need to be, then we would suggest there need to be some very clear markers about the kind of policy and evidential tests that will need to be passed in order to justify them. The second point, though, that the Minister, which is germane to this discussion, effectively says, well, the reason the viability concerns aren't a problem for this plan is that the viability of the 2011 plan can't be reasonably disputed, given it's been in place for a considerable amount of time and what's proposed are only moderate policy requirements. Effectively saying, well, the 2011 plan was fine, we're only adding in a small amount of extra cost, so therefore, what's the problem? Well, the problem with that assertion is that the 2011 plan delivered 3,758 homes over the 2011 to 2020 period, so about 375 per annum, whereas we know the new plan is looking to deliver a much higher number. And we know the original Ireland plan didn't meet its need, so the revised plan for 2013 to 2020 had an annual rate of 453 dwellings per annum, so demonstrably the existing Ireland plan wasn't viable because it wasn't bringing forward sufficient levels of viable development to meet the amount of housing that it sought to plan for. So if we're now looking at a plan that looks to ramp up the level of development, it increases the onus on the states to justify that the additional costs they're adding on to development are consistent with an increase, because more sites than have currently been brought forward will need to come forward in order to deliver that higher rate of development. Final point, I think, is and I come to this from a UK perspective rather than a Jersey Island perspective, but in the UK, what happens is that when you look at a 5-year sort of period for delivery of homes, there's effectively a release valve if it turns out that the planned strategy isn't viable, because you have the requirement for a 5-year land supply, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, and the housing delivery test. If homes aren't coming forward, effectively speculative development can come forward. And in the UK, that's often outside settlement boundaries. Now, that may or may not be appropriate in Jersey for the reasons that were very eloquently described by the gentleman from the farmers' organisation. But I think the point is, given we don't have that release valve, it increases the focus on ensuring that the policies of this plan are compatible with the viable delivery of development in the way that it's anticipated. Because if it turns out they're not viable, then effectively there's nowhere for the plan to go, and we'll have another 5-year period in which housing needs have not been met. So I think for us, the position would be that the Bridging Island plan shouldn't introduce any new policy requirements that add cost to the development without there being the robust evidence to justify it in viability terms, given the increased scale of development that exists. And at the moment, unfortunately, we don't think that robust evidence does exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Does the States want to come back on any of that?
Thank you. I think there's probably a couple of points to make within this, and the first one is just to say that yes, we have said, that considering the viability of the proposed Sustainable Communities Fund needs to be considered at that time rather than today, because we do appreciate that has the potential to have a very significant effect on development potential, and we want to consider that properly, and we will consider the views of the Construction Council at that time. Another point that was made is that obviously the statement that it's wrong to be introducing new requirements in the context of uncertainty, where that might impact on development viability. Well, there, of course, there's a flip side to that argument, that in the context of requiring new homes, attention to the climate emergency, increasing development standards to make sure that we are taking proper care of our environment as we have made international commitments to do so, that we need to apply additional planning requirements to make sure that that happens. So there's a difficult choice to be made there, and unfortunately in this case it has fallen in favour of requiring development standards to be improved rather than the viability potential impact. The 2017 study of viability that was undertaken for the potential inclusion of the Jersey Infrastructure Levy, as we say, the industry have their views about the methodology of that work at the time. That was taken to create a baseline for an assumption in the 2021 context, but we must remember that the 2021 context is difficult to establish a firm baseline, and even if we had fully re-undertaken that work, it would not have provided the answer that I think that the Construction Council or ourselves would have been hoping for, so we had to make the best of the information that we had available to us.
I mean, one of the interesting questions, of course, when you're talking about viability, and it's very relevant in the SIL context, of course, is what a landowner's expectations are about the value of their land. And of course, if you have, and one of the advantages, I guess, of having the idea of a sustainable communities levy coming in the future, in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, is developers can take that into account when they negotiate with landowners now. Because if you didn't have that warning, developers quite legitimately would come and say, well, hang on, we bought this land and we didn't know this requirement was coming along the road. So there is an advantage, at least in signalling that this is something that you're going to be looking at. And once you looked at it, you then got the issue of, well, will landowners, we're back to benchmarks, will landowners accept £1 million for their site rather than £1.5 million or £1 million or 1.2? And that has to just work through the system. And I think our experience in England is that if you impose a sill charge, if local authorities don't implement that rigorously, they get turned over by the development industry, quite frankly. If they implement it strongly, then eventually the development industry has to recognise, well, actually, we have to take this into account on the cost side of the equation. Anybody got any view about that?
Thank you. Yes, so the Jersey Infrastructure Levy as a value capture mechanism has been a long-standing ambition within Jersey to achieve some benefit back to the community from the value increment that's created from the grant of planning consent. So that work started, I think, in 2016 and went to the States Assembly in 2017. Towards the time of an election and very narrowly missed becoming adopted policy for Jersey. So very, very close call for the industry last time round to avoid a charge. That ambition never went away just because it didn't make it through the Assembly at that time, and we've now committed with a 5-year lead-in time essentially that we want to explore that again, but we need to redo the work again because a lot has changed in that period of time. So I think you're very right that the lead-in time should be a very firm indicator to the industry that this is something that we continue to aspire to achieve. With regard to additional detailed thematic planning requirements that arise as a result of the plan, they have had a year-long lead-in time before they become a requirement, and of course they are at a much lower level. They are about adjusting how development takes place at a much smaller scale. Yeah. So we too feel that that is a very reasonable lead-in time and warning for the development industry to respond and innovate. So I think we've spoken today about the low-hanging fruit, is that it's easy to say that development has to be easy in order for it to happen. I think it works on both sides. The planning framework has to be enabling, but equally the development industry have to respond to the context that we are in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mrs. Mine.
Thank you. I think the key, if you just look at one figure in the evidence that we produced, it would be figure 1, which basically has the comparison of residual land value of brownfield sites against the benchmark value that's assumed in the original study. And what that shows is frankly just huge variation in the benchmark land values that are being achieved on effectively residential development sites within the urban area. And what that shows is that as soon as you apply a flat rate or an obligation, you have to accept, I mean, it's the classic thing about what's an average or a normal development. If your head's in the oven and your feet are in the freezer, on average you're comfortable. But in a sense, actually with developments that you've got here, there are huge variations that mean if you pitch it at a particular level, you risk a high number of sites not coming forward because the landowner will look at that benchmark land value and go, well, that's basically doesn't work for the site to come forward, and we'll have an alternative commercial use potentially that site can come forward to, and therefore that increases the risk that a significant number of the urban capacity sites that are being relied upon for the plan won't actually be delivered in the way that's intended. And if we look at London, for example, as a constrained urban area without the land release valve that you have in other locations, about 50% of planning permissions don't get implemented in London, because effectively you get a consent, you then have to look at implementing it, looking at the costs of development, the abnormals you've identified, and there are fixed charges in London, but what that means is that a significant number of those units don't actually get delivered, and I think that's the risk of applying a fixed charge and extra obligations to urban sites in Jersey. And of course, as an island, there's literally nowhere else for it to go. There's no release valve, which basically increases the risk that the plan won't deliver on the housing that it's seeking to achieve.
So, are you telling us that in Jersey, the benchmark land value within the built-up areas, in many cases, is so high that actually a residential developer, for example, couldn't afford to buy the site to build his houses or his flats?
That's what the evidence suggests, yeah. Particularly if you add in extra costs, and then you've got to factor in the abnormals and so on and so forth. And then it comes to, of course, what density has been achieved, because the residual value will then be related to the number of units, and then that goes to the uncertainty as to how many units you can actually accommodate on site. And I think the other point, just to come back to, I think, on this, is there's often an assumption in these land value capture debates that the residual value is one that basically just fluctuates, and you can basically sort of turn it up or down based upon the cost that you apply. But of course that only works if there is a choice in the land market that developers can exercise that choice. And what the plan says at page 186 is that the most significant barrier facing housing delivery is the supply of land, and the impact of this on the cost of land. High land costs coupled with relatively high build costs are the key drivers of the supply and cost of new housing in Jersey. So given the shortage of land supply, it's more likely that developers, faced with that situation, will end up having to absorb any charge against their margin on the cost of development rather than it coming off the land value, which again adds an extra sort of barrier in terms of delivery.
Okay. Right. Does anybody else have anything else to add? Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I was just going to return to question 4 on the published agenda, and if I may, again, as I did this morning, return to your opening statement that we're here to assist in your testing of the evidence, and the evidence should be clear, realistic, robust, certain, all the terms we've heard throughout the day. And if I might look in particular, as we have done already, at Table 1, sources of housing supply. I think we've heard things today which have been news to me, and I think that in my mind there's a great deal of uncertainty about the content of that table, particularly the transparency, the data behind it. We've heard about the shortfall over the 2011 period of 1,800 units. That's apparently been set out in a Statistics Jersey calculation. I'm not aware that anyone has seen that calculation, how that figure has been reached. Is that figure correct? We've just been told that is the shortfall. So we haven't seen the workings, the transparency behind that. And I think that theme comes out in my observations throughout this table. Under construction, we have the figure of 700 units. That is apparently the same as the stock of planning permissions. We like to believe that's the case, but we haven't seen that set out anywhere. What are those sites? Which sites are under construction? We have had an update on the completion figures. We've now got 4,058 units which have been confirmed as complete over the last island plan period. We've just been told that's the answer. We haven't been shown the data. We haven't been able to see if that is indeed robust. We've heard today that 130 units per annum are approved outside St Helier in rural areas outside the countryside, the other built-up area parts of the island. We haven't got that data. That figure has, again, just been given to us, and we're asked to accept that is correct. There is apparently a town capacity study which has been used to inform the windfalls. Again, we haven't got that, sir. No one's seen that. We've just been asked to accept that the conclusions are robust and that they inform that table. None of this data is available to probe, to test. The transparency is, in my mind, lacking. The current island plan says that housing monitoring information will be published on an annual basis. It says it will be broken down. Housing mix will be explained. The affordable open market mix will be set out. I'm not aware that data is available or has ever been made available in the period since 2011. Yet we have a table in H1 which we're told is all present and correct, and we're ready to go again. I would like to see evidence which we can properly test and observe that transparency, sir.
Thank you very much. There we are for the states. You haven't justified any of your figures.
Everyone looks at Ralph. Everyone's pointing at me. Well, we certainly can provide that. There is stats that are provided on government as an overall total number of completions, which is available to everyone to see. As talking about the capacity study, as I said, it was mainly the kind of windfall rate that we looked at that was the sort of main sort of driver for evidence, and we kind of put in an estimate of a proportion of that being met rather than actually looking at specifics on it. So, I mean, the data is available. I mean, I'm happy to provide it in a format that can be digested. And we can go from there. That's not a problem.
It does seem surprising to me that the data that who are very experienced local planners in the area don't know about the data.
So I did ask for the data right at the outset of the island plan process and was told that the government hoped to publish it.
Mrs. Skelton, are you going to respond? It's a serious allegation.
Well, it's with an eye on the future capability to publish that data. So the government have made provision to invest in a strategic housing and regeneration unit, which is in the process of being set up, and that will have a role within it responsible for more up-to-date management of that sort of data, including publication. So I think we recognise there have been some challenges. I think that's not to underplay that, but as my colleague says, that data can certainly be provided and does exist.
But if Mr. Nicholson's right, then how are we supposed to make a judgment here about how reliable your data is?
Well, I mean, it's the best available data that we had. It's taken in context in the housing land assessment. It provides for the conversations that we've had to date. I think if there are questions about levels of detail below that, then we're very happy to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, it's driven by our planning and building systems, which obviously has the outputs that we have to rely on another department to provide that information. So it's all generated from that record system.
I mean, I can see that obviously applies to housing completions, for example, but it's more tricky when it's the assessment of what the potential windfall yield might be in town, for example.
Absolutely, it's all about looking at the data that we have in front of us in terms of windfall rates and applying some sort of sensible assessment of what the future sort of number might be. In terms of the other question I think you raised, Mr. Nicholson, was around the 1800, which I think Statistics Jersey did for us. I'm sure they can provide equally their calculations on how that was arisen, how that came about.
Do you want to say anything about that, Statistics Jersey?
Just to give some background to it, we obviously provided population projections and household projections for the 2011 island plan in the first instance. That effectively set the demand figure that was originally included in there. We publish the population projections as a report every few years. We publish the household projections as well. Those are all available on the government website. What we did in this instance was to review the period that we've actually experienced, looking at our population estimates for each individual year, and then effectively redoing the calculation that we would have done in 2011 based on what the actual experience was over that period of time, with an assumption for the last few years of the plan. Again, all of the estimates and the bits that make up that we publish and are available, and obviously we can provide if required.
Mr. Nicholson?
I've searched high and low for these figures. I don't know if you've had them provided, but I think they are important as part of this debate. It's a very large part of the housing needs, and I think we all need to be clear, one way or the other, on how that's been reached. I would love for it to be published, and similarly, if Windfall trends are an extrapolation of the last 10-year figures, please publish them, because I've got no idea what the Windfall delivery rate has been over the last 10 years. It's not, as far as I'm aware, ever been made clear for 1 year, never mind 10.
Right. I don't know if we can take this any further.
I suppose only to accept the request and to confirm that we will find the most expeditious way to provide that information.
And to us.
Sorry, that was my intent.
There's no annual, you don't produce an annual monitoring report?
It would be worth highlighting that in the performance chapter of the plan, we do acknowledge that we've had many challenges in monitoring the plan performance. It's essentially a manual exercise where a relatively senior officer sits and counts planning applications, units in, units out, metre squares gained, metres squared lost, extremely labour-intensive work, which we have produced up until I think 2019 as an internal document, but obviously for the intensity that it is to validate the wider plan performance work, we make the decision to not widely publicise that document as we were developing the plan, but we do have that data available. What the plan basically suggests is that we do need to invest into a better performance monitoring capability, which would sit within our development control function, who register planning applications. They deal with planning completions, and that data needs to be more effectively captured. Now, I'm not saying this in relation to the housing supply figures, which are manually monitored very closely, but this is the broader issue of plan performance, and I think we've been very open about this in the draft plan, that we do need to improve our capability.
Emily, it would be nice to see what you've got, even if it's just to try and get a handle on the Windfall calculations based on past performance, say from 2011 to 2019. If you've got those as figures and they could be made available, Mr. Kingsbury and others can look at them as well. I think that would be helpful. I mean, if you could do it, obviously, within a week, we're not going to be here that long. That would be very helpful.
I think, yes. I mean, if you could produce a short paper for us and for distribution, telling us
basic figures.
How have you reached your figures? What information you've got, what information you've had to say, well, we haven't got that information, we're going to use assumptions. If you've used assumptions, what assumptions have you used? If you can do that for us, please, particularly for the Windfall figures.
We will.
Good, thank you.
Right. Anything else from anybody? Yes, sir.
Bob Goddard, representing the Chamber of Commerce. Just on that matter, which we've just been discussing, it is actually a requirement of the current island plan that the planning department produce updated housing figures, housing need figures, and they've never been able to produce those. And the reason why it hasn't been done is because there simply isn't resources within the planning department to actually do all of this kind of additional work. And moving on to I know it's not exactly what we were talking about at the moment, but the thing is there's so many elements of this new island plan which require resourcing and time from the planning department to make them effective. We just cannot believe that it's possibly going to happen, because historically it hasn't happened, and I don't see additional resources coming into the department.
Thank you, but I don't know what we're supposed to do about that. Right, anybody else? Well, thank you very much for your attendance and your help today. We will see some of you, or different people as well, tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you.